There are very few cities that feel like they shouldn't exist. Las Vegas is one of them. If you've ever driven there, you know exactly what I mean. You're cruising through hours of desert, just rock, scrub, brush, and mountains, and then almost out of nowhere, the skyline appears. Giant casinos, roller coasters, a miniature Eiffel Tower, a pyramid, a castle. Somehow somebody looked at one of the hottest, driest places in North America and thought, you know what this needs? A city that never sleeps. It's ridiculous, and yet it worked. More than 40 million people visit Las Vegas every year. They come to gamble, to concerts, get married at 2 in the morning, eat at celebrity restaurants, and convince themselves that this is finally the trip they were going to beat the casino. Spoiler alert, you won't. Now, most people know Las Vegas has a reputation for organized crime. They know names like Bugsy Siegel or have seen movies like Casino. Maybe they've heard stories about mobsters skimming millions of dollars out of casino vaults. But here's the thing, the mob didn't create Las Vegas. They recognized an opportunity that was already there. Welcome back to Meals to Unalive For, the podcast where true crime, dark history, conspiracy, and food collide. I'm your host, Jody Breton, and every week we serve up the stories that are as disturbing as they are fascinating, paired with a meal inspired by the chaos. So grab a plate, lock your doors, and let's dig in. Today, we'll be making homemade Alfredo and homemade breadsticks. Because long before the casinos, before the showgirls, before Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack, Las Vegas had already developed a reputation as a place where rules were a little bit more flexible than everywhere else. And honestly, when you look at where the city is, that makes almost perfect sense. The Mojave Desert isn't welcoming. In the summer, temperatures regularly climb well over 100 degrees. Water is scarce, and if your car breaks down 50 miles from the nearest town, you're going to have a very bad day. So why here? Well, thousands of years before anyone thought about slot machines, there was one thing hidden beneath all of the sand that made this place incredibly valuable: water. Natural springs bubbled up from underground, creating an oasis in the middle of an otherwise unforgiving landscape. The southern Paiute people had lived in and around these springs for generations, relying on them long before European explorers ever showed up. Natural springs bubbled up from the underground, creating an oasis in the middle of an otherwise unforgiving landscape. The southern Paiute people had lived in and around these springs for generations, relying on them long before European explorers ever showed up. Then in 1829, a Mexican trader named Antonio Armijo passed through while traveling the old Spanish Trail. When he reached the area, he found something that must have felt almost impossible after days in the desert green grass. Enough of it that he named the place Las Vegas, or the Meadows. I always think that's funny because if you've been to modern Las Vegas, meadows probably isn't the first word that comes to mind. Today, it's concrete, neon, and traffic. Back then, though, the name actually made perfect sense. For decades, that's all Las Vegas really was: a stopover. Travelers rested, watered their animals, and continued west. Nobody was building grand cities here. Nobody was talking about fortunes or casinos. It was just another waypoint in a massive desert. Then came the railroad, and that's when everything started to snowball. Railroads needed reliable access to water, and Las Vegas happened to have it. In 1905, the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Road auctioned off land around its new depot, and almost overnight, a town began taking shape. Now, if you listen to this podcast for a while, you already know what tends to happen when a boom town appears. You get workers, workers bring in money, money attracts gamblers, and gamblers attract hustlers. And before long, somebody's opening up a saloon, somebody else is running card games in the back room, and somebody's waking up next morning wondering where their paychecks disappeared. Las Vegas was no different. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't polished, it was dusty, loud, rough around the edges, and full of people trying to make a living however they could. Which, as we're about to find out, made it the perfect place for what came next. Las Vegas was this rough little railroad town in the middle of nowhere. It had saloons, card games, brothels, and enough people passing through to keep everyone in business, but it still wasn't what we recognize as Las Vegas today. If you had visited in the 1920s, you wouldn't have seen giant casinos or elaborate hotels. You would have seen a dusty frontier town that just happened to sit on an important railroad line. Then the Great Depression hit. When people think about the Great Depression, they usually picture New York after the stock market crash or the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma. But the economic collapse hit just about every corner of the country, including Nevada. The state's economy had always been a little bit shaky. Mining had brought people west, but boom towns had a habit of becoming ghost towns since the ore started running out. By the late 1920s, Nevada needed something new to keep money flowing into the state. Now, here's the interesting part. Most states responded to the Depression by tightening their belts. Nevada looked around and basically said, well, what do people still spend money on when times are bad? The answer? Entertainment. In March of 1931, Nevada legalized wide open casino gambling. Today, that doesn't sound particularly groundbreaking because Vegas and gambling are practically the same thing in our minds. But at the time, this was pretty radical of a move. Most of the country viewed gambling as something that belonged in back rooms, hidden card games, or illegal betting parlors. Nevada knew all of that. They just decided the economic benefits outweighed the risk. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Almost overnight, businesses that had been operating in the shadows suddenly had a legal way to make money. Small gambling halls expanded, hotels added gaming rooms. Investors started paying attention to a state that most Americans rarely thought about. But if legalized gambling gave Las Vegas a foundation, another project turned it into a boomtown. About 30 miles southeast of the city, construction began on what was then called Boulder Dam, though today we know it as Hoover Dam. It's hard to overstate just how massive this project was. Imagine standing at the bottom of a black canyon in the middle of summer. The temperature is well over 110 degrees. The canyon walls trap the heat, making it feel even hotter. You're drilling through solid rock, surrounded by dynamite blasts, dust, and heavy machinery, knowing that one mistake could send thousands of pounds of rock crashing down on you. That was just another workday. Thousands of men came to southern Nevada hoping to land one of these jobs. Some had crossed the country looking for work after losing everything during the Great Depression. Others were veterans of construction projects who went wherever the next paycheck had to be. And if you'd like to learn more about the Hoover Dam, we do have a full episode regarding the Hoover Dam and its dark history posted. If you got hired to work on the Hoover Dam, the work was exhausting, but it paid. And every Friday, those workers had something they hadn't had in a long time: money in their pockets. Now here's where Las Vegas gets lucky. The government built a company town called Boulder City to house many of the dam workers. On paper, it sounded ideal. There was just one problem. Boulder City was dry. No gambling, no alcohol, no nightlife. The federal government wanted it to be orderly, respectable, and free of the distractions they worried might interfere with construction. If you've ever told thousands of young men in their 20s what they can't do after getting paid, you can probably guess what happened next. They drove to Las Vegas. Every weekend, cars poured into the city carrying workers who wanted a decent meal, a stiff drink, a card game, and maybe a chance to forget about work for the night. It's funny when you think about it. The federal government was trying to build one of the greatest engineering products of American history, and in the process, it accidentally created a steady stream of customers for Nevada's brand new gambling industry. Las Vegas couldn't have asked for better timing if it had planned the whole thing. The city's businesses expanded almost as fast as they could build them. Restaurants stayed open later, bars got busier, hotels filled up, and Fremont Street became the center of all of it. If you've never seen old photos of Fremont Street, it's worth looking them up. It doesn't look anything like the modern strip. There aren't giant themed resorts or dancing fountains. The buildings are modest, the streets are narrow, and by today's standards, it almost looks quaint. But for the people who lived there in the 1930s, it felt alive. Neon signs blinked through the desert darkness. Music drifted out of open doorways. Dice rolled across felt tables. People laughed, argued, celebrated, and occasionally lost more money than they could afford. That last part, by the way, hasn't really changed. Something else was happening too. Las Vegas was starting to build a reputation, not just as a place to gamble, but as a place where you could get away with things. If your hometown frowned on drinking, Vegas didn't care. If you wanted to stay up until sunrise, Vegas didn't care. If you wanted to blow an entire paycheck at the blackjack table, well, the casino certainly wasn't going to stop you. That attitude became part of the city's identity. Las Vegas wasn't selling games, it was selling freedom, or at least the illusion of it. For a weekend, you could pretend the rules didn't apply. You could become somebody else. You could take risks you wouldn't dream of taking back home. That's an incredibly powerful business model. And it wasn't just tourists who noticed. Businessmen, investors, politicians, and eventually the mob noticed. Now, I don't want to make it sound like gangsters immediately descended on Las Vegas the second gambling became legal. That's one of those Hollywood myths that's more entertaining than it is accurate. The truth is, organized crime had been watching Nevada from a distance for years. Back east, mobsters made fortunes through illegal gambling, bootlegging, and loan sharking. Those businesses were profitable, but they came with constant police raids, arrests, and competition from rival gangs. Nevada offered something they've never really had before: a legal casino. Think about that for a second. Instead of hiding your gambling operation in the basement of a social club, you could own a beautiful building with your name on the front, welcome customers through the front door, and make millions of dollars without pretending to be something else. To someone in organized crime, that wasn't just appealing, it was genius. The casinos generated mountains of cash every single day, and the cash is notoriously difficult to track. In an era before computers, sophisticated surveillance, and digital banking, keeping a few stacks of bills off the books wasn't nearly as difficult as it would be today. That realization would completely change the future of Las Vegas. But before the mob could truly take control of the city, one man would make a gamble so enormous that if it failed, it probably would have ended his career. His name was Benjamin Siegel. Most people knew him by another name, Bugsy. If you ask 10 people who built Las Vegas, there's a good chance at least a few of them will say the same name, Bugsy Siegel. Movies love that version of the story. One brilliant, larger-than-life gangster arrives in the desert, builds the Flamingo, and transforms Las Vegas into the gambling capital of the world. It's a great story. The only problem is, it's not entirely true. Did Bugsy Siegel play a huge role in Las Vegas history? Absolutely. Did he single-handedly create modern Las Vegas? Not even close. By the time Benjamin Siegel arrived, Las Vegas had already been growing for decades. Gambling was legal, Hoover Dam had brought in thousands of workers to southern Nevada. Fremont Street was thriving, and investors had already started looking at the desert as a place where serious money could be made. Bugsy didn't invent the opportunity. He simply saw how much bigger it could become. Benjamin Siegel was born in Brooklyn, New York, 1906, to Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. His family was poor, and the neighborhood he grew up in wasn't exactly forgiving. As a teenager, Siegel teamed up with another young man named Meyer Lansky. The two started small extorting neighborhoods, pushcart vendors, stealing and running, protecting rackets, and they quickly gained a reputation for being fearless, or maybe reckless, depending on who you ask. The two eventually became part of what historians call the Jewish mob, a loose network of Jewish American gangsters who often worked alongside the Italian Mafia. During Prohibition, they made enormous amounts of money through bootlegging and developing relationships with some of the most powerful organized crime figures in the country, including Charles Lucky Lucino. By the 1930s, Siegel wasn't just another street thug. He was wealthy, well connected, and known for having an explosive temper. Now, we should probably talk about the nickname. Most people know him as Bugsy, but according to people who actually knew him, he hated it. The nickname came from the phrase crazy as a bedbug. Friends claimed he could go from charming to violent in the blink of an eye. If someone called him Bugsy to his face and they weren't close to him, they were taking a pretty significant risk. He preferred Ben. Unfortunately for him, history had other plans. Unlike a lot of gangsters of the era, Siegel looked more like a movie star than a mob boss. He dressed impeccably and spent money freely, dated actresses, and seemed pretty comfortable around celebrities. He cultivated that image on purpose. He didn't want to hide in the shadows. He wanted people to admire him. That confidence or ego, depending on your perspective, would eventually lead him to the Mojave Desert. In the mid 1940s, Siegel began spending more time in California. Hollywood fascinated him, but another opportunity caught his attention: Las Vegas. At the time, most casinos were clustered around Fremont Street in downtown Las Vegas. They were profitable but relatively modest. Then there was Highway 91. Today we call it Las Vegas Boulevard or simply the Strip. Back then, it was mostly empty desert, and that's what made it interesting. A man named Billy Wilkerson had already started building a luxury hotel there called the Flamingo. Wilkerson wasn't a gangster. He was a Hollywood publisher who owned the Hollywood Reporter. He envisioned something completely different from the gambling halls downtown. He wanted elegance. A resort where wealthy Californians could fly in, relax by a swimming pool, enjoy fine dining, watch live entertainment, and gamble without feeling like they were walking into a smoky back room full of card sharks. It was a surprisingly modern idea, but the problem was that Wilkerson was running out of money. Construction costs were spiraling out of control, and he needed investors. That's where organized crime entered the picture. Exactly how the deal unfolded is still debated by historians. Some believe Wilkerson willingly partnered with the mob because he had no other option. Others argued he was pressured into giving up control of the project. Either way, by the end of it, Benjamin Siegel was in charge, and he had a vision. Not just another casino, the finest resort America had ever seen. Looking back, it's easy to understand why the project became so expensive. Siegel wasn't interested in building something practical. He wanted imported marble, luxurious furnishing, beautiful landscaping, high-end restaurants, expensive suites. The kind of place where movie stars would actually want to stay. The problem was that none of this came cheap. The original budget ballooned at an astonishing rate. Money kept disappearing. Invoices grew larger, construction dragged on, and before long, the men financing the project back east started asking uncomfortable questions. Where was all the money going? Were contractors stealing from the project? Was Siegel being cheated? Or was Siegel stealing from them? Even today, historians don't completely agree on the answer. There are stories about expensive design changes, supply shortages after World War II, corruption among contractors, kickbacks, and outright embezzlement. It's entirely possible that several of those things were happening at once. What we do know is this: the Flamingo was costing far more than anyone had planned, and the mob doesn't tend to be patient when millions of dollars are involved. Despite mounting pressure, Siegel pushed forward. He believed that once people saw the finished resort, they'd understand. He was building the future, and in a way, he was right. Unfortunately, the future arrived a little too early. On December 26, 1946, the Flamingo opened its doors. It was a disaster. A winter rainstorm kept many travelers away. Construction wasn't actually finished. Guests complained about unfinished rooms, some amenities still weren't operating, and after only a couple weeks, the Flamingo temporarily shut down so construction could continue. For most businessmen, this would have been embarrassing. For Benjamin Siegel, it was dangerous, because the people who had invested in the Flamingo weren't ordinary shareholders expecting a quarterly report. They were some of the most powerful organized crime figures in America, and they wanted answers. Now, if your investors are upset today, they might sue you. Maybe they'll force you out as a CEO, maybe you'll lose your job. When your investors were the Mafia, the consequences looked a little different. On the evening of June 20th, 1947, Siegel wasn't in Las Vegas at all. He was relaxing at the Beverly Hills home of his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. She was out of town and Bugsy was sitting in the living room, reportedly reading the newspaper and chatting with one of Hill's friends. Just after 10:45 that night, someone stepped outside the house and fired a rifle through the front window. The first bullet struck Siegel in the head. Several more tore through the room. By the time it was over, Benjamin Siegel was dead. The shooter disappeared into the night. And to this day, nobody has been officially charged with the murder. Naturally, theories have been in short supply. Some believe the order came directly from the East Coast crime bosses who had grown tired of the Flamingo's endless expenses. Others think Siegel had been skimming money from the project itself. Still, others argue he had simply become too unpredictable to trust. The truth is, we may never know exactly who gave the order, but here's something that often gets left out of the story. The Flamingo didn't die with Bugsy. In fact, it finally started making money. Immediately after his death, control shifted to other mob-connected figures. Construction wrapped up and the casino began attracting exactly the kind of wealthy clientele Siegel had imagined. Ironically, the vision he had been mocked for was suddenly proving itself. His biggest mistake wasn't dreaming too big, it was surviving long enough to spend everyone else's money. And that brings us to one of the biggest misconceptions about Las Vegas history. Bugsy Siegel did not create a mob empire. He simply proved that luxury casinos could generate incredible amounts of money. Once that became obvious, every major crime family wanted a piece. Over the next 2 decades, organized crime quietly expanded its influence across Las Vegas. The Chicago outfit, the Cleveland crime family, Kansas City, Milwaukee, New Orleans, they weren't fighting over territory the way they'd done during Prohibition. They were investing. Casinos became businesses, extremely profitable on the surface, and everything looked legitimate. People checked into hotels, they bought show tickets, they ordered expensive dinners, they played blackjack until sunrise. Every dollar looked perfectly legal. Behind the scenes, things were a little different. This is probably a good place to explain something you've heard over and over again anytime you read about the mob in Las Vegas: the skim. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but unless someone explains it, it's easy to miss why it mattered so much. Let's say your casino made $1 million this month. Normally, that money gets counted. Taxes get paid, employees get paid, the owner receives whatever profits are left. Now imagine someone quietly removes $200,000 before the books are ever completed. As far as the government knows, that money never existed. No paperwork or taxes or questions, and simply gone. That's skimming. And casinos were almost perfect places to do it. Remember, we're talking about an era before computerized accounting systems, digital surveillance, and sophisticated financial audits. Most transactions involved stacks of cash. Millions of dollars flowed through casinos every single week. If you knew which employees to trust or intimidate, it wasn't terribly difficult to make bundles of cash disappear. That money didn't stay in Las Vegas. It traveled. Suitcases full of cash left Nevada for Chicago, Kansas City, and Cleveland, where it was divided among the families that secretly controlled the casinos. For years, it worked remarkably well. The public saw glamorous resorts. The government collected taxes. Tourists enjoyed vacations. Meanwhile, organized crime quietly siphoned off millions of dollars behind the scenes. One of the biggest reasons they were able to expand so quickly was money from an unlikely source, the Teamsters Union. Specifically, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. Now, before anyone listening starts wondering if their retirement account is secretly funding a casino, let's explain what was happening. The pension fund held an enormous amount of money collected for workers' retirement benefits. Some of those funds were loaned to finance new casino construction in Las Vegas. On paper, that wasn't necessarily unusual. Pension funds invest money all the time. The problem was who controlled many of those decisions. Through corruption, intimidation, and relationships with organized crime, certain mob figures were able to influence where those loans went. The result? New casinos kept appearing across the strip, and many of them came with invisible partners. Tourists saw beautiful hotels. The mob saw another opportunity to skim cash. By the 1960s and 1970s, Las Vegas had become something remarkable, not just because of its entertainment, not because of the gambling, because organized crime had figured out how to hide in plain sight. Instead of operating illegal casinos, they owned legal ones. Or more accurately, they often owned the people who owned them. And if someone threatened that arrangement, well, history has shown the mob wasn't exactly known for calm business negotiations. That brings us to two men whose names are forever linked with the final chapter of mob-controlled Las Vegas. One ran the casinos, the other enforced the rules. Frank Lefty Rosenthal and Tony Spilatro. If you've seen the movie Casino, you've met fictional versions of both men. The real story is somehow even stranger. By the 1970s, Las Vegas had become almost unrecognizable. The little railroad town we'd been talking about was gone. In its place stood massive casinos, luxury hotels, elaborate stage shows, enough flashing neon to light up the desert for miles. Millions of people came every year hoping to hit the jackpot. The mob had something else in mind. They hoped those people would lose, because the more money flowing through the casinos, the more there was to skim. Now, if there was one man who understood how to make a casino profitable, it was Frank Rosenthal. Unlike a lot of gangsters, Frank wasn't a hitman. He wasn't known for intimidation. His weapons were mathematics. Rosenthal had spent years studying gambling from every angle. He knew the odds better than most dealers. He understood which games attracted people, how long they stayed at the tables, and most importantly, how to keep them coming back. Casinos don't actually need every player to lose. They just need enough people to believe that they're one lucky hand away from winning. Frank understood that better than almost anyone. Eventually, he found himself running several of the biggest casinos in Las Vegas, including the Stardust, the Fremont, the Marina, and the Hacienda. Officially, he wasn't supposed to be. Because of his gambling background and alleged organized crime connections, Nevada regulators refused to grant him a gaming license. So instead of putting Frank's name on the paperwork, the casinos installed front men. Someone else appeared to be in charge. Everyone knew who really was making the decisions. It's honestly one of those situations where nobody was fooling anyone. And while Frank handled the business side, another man handled everything else. Tony Spilatro. If Frank Rosenthal was the brain, Tony Spilatro was the fist. Tony grew up in Chicago and earned a reputation for violence long before he ever set foot in Nevada. The Chicago outfit eventually sent him to Las Vegas with a fairly simple job description: protects the protect the outfit's investment. That sounds almost respectable until you realize what protect meant. If someone stole from the mob, Tony dealt with it. If someone talked too much, also Tony. If someone threatened the skim, Tony dealt with that too. His reputation spread quickly. Even people who had never met him knew his name. And fear has a funny way of doing half the work for you. But here's where things started to fall apart. Tony wasn't content staying behind the scenes. He loved attention. He drove expensive cars. He socialized with celebrities. He wanted people to know who he was. That might work if you're a movie star. It's a terrible strategy if you're trying to quietly run organized crime. Around the same time, another problem emerged. Tony wasn't satisfied collecting money from the casinos. He wanted more. And that's when he and a group of associates became known as the Hole in the Wall Gang. The name sounds almost comical. It came from the group's preferred method of burglary. Instead of picking locks or forcing open doors, they'd drill through the walls or ceilings of neighboring businesses to get inside. Jewelry stores, electronic stores, high-end retailers. If there was something valuable inside, they figured out how to reach it without ever using the front door. It worked until it didn't. As law enforcement increased surveillance, investigators began connecting burglary after burglary to the same group of suspects. And once federal agents started watching Tony Spilotro more closely, they began noticing something much bigger than stolen jewelry. The FBI had suspected for years that casinos were being skimmed. Now they believed they might finally be able to prove it. At this point, the Bureau had devoted enormous resources to organized crime across the country. Wiretaps, undercover operations, financial investigations, it all started pointing back towards Las Vegas. The casinos weren't just places where money changed hands. They were evidence, and every employee who handled cash became a potential witness. The mob had managed to stay one step ahead for years, but technology was improving. Investigators were getting smarter, and the people involved were becoming sloppier. There's another interesting detail that often gets overlooked. The thing that ultimately hurt the mob wasn't just the FBI, it was greed. The more successful Las Vegas became, the more people wanted a bigger share of the money. More casinos, partners, employees, and opportunities for someone to talk. Criminal organizations have always had one major weakness. The larger they become, the harder they are to keep secret. By the early 1980s, federal prosecutors had assembled one of the biggest organized crime investigations in Las Vegas history. Using testimony from insiders, surveillance, financial records, and wiretaps, they slowly exposed how much money had been flowing out of the casino counting rooms and into the pockets of crime families hundreds of miles away. The scam that had once seemed almost invisible was finally being dragged into the light. Frank Rosenthal eventually found himself pushed out of the casinos he'd helped build into financial powerhouses. Tony Spilotro's story ended much more violently. In June of 1986, Tony and his younger brother Michael were lured to what they believed was a meeting with a fellow member of the Chicago outfit. Instead, they were beaten to death. Their bodies were later discovered in an Indiana cornfield, buried in a shallow grave. For years, rumors had circulated that Tony had become too reckless, too visible, too independent. Whether that was the sole reason or not, one thing is clear. The outfit had decided that Tony had become a liability instead of an asset. It was the ending that almost felt inevitable. The same organization that had elevated him ultimately eliminated him. By the end of the decade, the era of mob-controlled Las Vegas was coming to a close. Not because organized crime had suddenly grown a conscience, because it had finally become bad for business, and corporate America was waiting in the wings. By the late 1980s, the writing was on the wall. Federal investigations had exposed the skim. Mob bosses were heading to prison. Others had been murdered. The old guard that had quietly controlled Las Vegas for decades was disappearing one way or another. For the first time in a long time, it looked like organized crime was finally losing its grip on the city. But here's the funny thing about Las Vegas. It has always been incredibly good at reinventing itself. As one era was ending, another was already beginning. Instead of gangsters investing in casinos, Wall Street was. Large corporations began buying up resorts and building properties that dwarfed anything the mob had imagined. One of the biggest names behind that transformation was Steve Wynn. Love or hate him, it's hard to deny the impact he had on modern Las Vegas. In 1989, Wynn opened the Mirage, and it completely changed what people expected from a casino. Before then, casinos were still casinos. The gambling floor was the main attraction, and everything else was there to support it. The Mirage flipped that idea on its head. Suddenly, the resort itself became the attraction. There was a tropical rainforest in the lobby. A massive volcano erupted outside every night. Guests came just to walk around, eat, shop, or see a show, even if they never touched a slot machine. That became the blueprint. Not long after, places like the Luxor, Excalibur, Bellagio, the Venetian, Paris, and New York, every resort had to be bigger, stranger, and more elaborate than the one before it. Las Vegas wasn't just selling gambling anymore. It was selling an experience. Families started visiting, conventions moved in, celebrity chefs opened restaurants, world-famous musicians signed residency deals. The city that had once depended on poker tables and roulette wheels became one of the entertainment capitals of the world, and on the surface it looked like organized crime had disappeared. The days of mob bosses secretly controlling casino counting rooms were over. Corporate accounts had replaced gangsters. Surveillance cameras watched nearly every inch of the gaming floor. Financial audits became routine. The skim, at least on the scale it once existed, was no longer practical. So, case closed, right? Not exactly, because even though the mob lost control of Las Vegas, their fingerprints were still everywhere. Think about the strip itself. Many of the locations that millions of tourists visit every year were first developed because organized crime believed luxury casinos could work in the middle of the desert. Bugsy Siegel didn't invent the idea of Las Vegas, but he helped prove that people would travel hundreds of miles for a destination resort. The outfit showed just how profitable those resorts could become. Frank Rosenthal revolutionized the way casinos treated their customers. Free drinks, complimentary meals, luxury accommodations, big name entertainment. Those things weren't acts of generosity. They were carefully calculated business decisions designed to keep gamblers inside the casino as long as possible. Modern casinos still use many of those same ideas today. Walk into almost any resort on the strip and you'll notice there aren't many clocks. Finding an exit isn't always as straightforward as you'd expect. Everything from the lighting to the layout is designed to encourage you to stay just a little longer. Maybe play one more hand. Maybe spin one more slot machine. It's easy to think of those strategies as just clever marketing, but many of them were refined decades ago by people whose entire job was figuring out how to separate visitors from their money. The methods changed. The psychology didn't. There's another irony here that's hard to ignore. For years, Las Vegas tried to distance itself from its mob history. City leaders wanted people to think about luxury entertainment in world-class resorts, not organized crime. Today, the mob has become part of the marketing. You can visit the mob museum, take organized crime tours, eat at restaurants decorated with vintage gangster photographs, watch movies inspired by real events that happened right here. The history that once embarrassed the city now helps attract visitors. That's a pretty remarkable turnaround. But maybe it shouldn't surprise us. Las Vegas has always known how to turn almost anything into entertainment, even its own criminal past. When I started researching this episode, I expected to find a story about gangsters building casinos. Instead, I found something much more interesting. Las Vegas wasn't created by the mob. It wasn't even created by gambling. It was created by opportunity. A patch of desert with water, a railroad that needed to stop, a state desperate enough to legalize gambling during the Great Depression, a massive construction project that brought thousands of workers within driving distance. One decision led to another and another until eventually organized crime looked at this little desert town and realized something nobody else had yet. This place wasn't just a good investment, it had the potential to become one of the most profitable cities in America. For a while, and they were right. Today, more than 40 million people visit Las Vegas every year. Most of them will never think about Benjamin Siegel, or Meyer Lansky, or Frank Rosenthal, or Tony Spilatro. They'll watch the Bellagio fountains, see a concert, grab a dinner, maybe lose a little money at the blackjack table before heading back to their hotel. And honestly, that's exactly what Las Vegas wants. Because the city has always understood one simple truth. People don't come looking for history. They come here looking for a story they'll tell when they get home. It's just that, hidden beneath all the neon and luxury is another story. One built on ambition, greed, violence, and one very risky bet that happened to pay off.